I'm recording my homily for the fourth Sunday of Lent in 2017. And I have to apologize. This is one of those weeks where I feel like my homily never actually really gelled. I've been sick this weekend, and so I guess I just didn't put maybe quite as much effort into it. So I do apologize for that, because some of the things I'm going to talk about today were not even in my homily this Sunday. But just to the few things that were. So the readings today is the story of Jesus healing the blind man, right? You remember the story? He spits on the ground and makes a little bit of mud, a little bit of clay, and he rubs it in the blind man's eyes, and then he tells him to go wash at the pool of Siloam, and he goes and washes and he's healed. But it drives the Pharisees crazy, because he does these things on the Sabbath. And so from their perspective, they see him as violating the Sabbath by healing this man. And if you read about many of the healings that Jesus does, he does them on the Sabbath. And so I'm going to get into that a little bit in a second. But the first thing, and so I'm going to tie in last week's gospel in this week's gospel. So you remember last week's gospel. Last week's gospel was Jesus encountering the Samaritan woman at the well. And I want to put it in the context of the way I think Jesus desires for us to either respond to a situation or react to a situation. So reacting to a situation is often in a negative way. It's usually what Jesus does not do. So what are some examples of reacting? So we react to a situation oftentimes when we're afraid. And so when there's fear, somebody presents a problem to us, we react, right? We react out of fear. And so I can put forth my response, my solution is often perceiving the problem and perceiving people or the person in front of me as being part of the problem. And because of my fear, I render a judgment. It's just like, boom, it's there, right? Now, that is usually not the best way to solve the problem. But we all do it sometimes. The fear can be for any number of reasons, right? So, what are some situations when we might react? We get criticized at work, right? Get an evaluation that's not very positive. We can react to it. We can fire off an email, right, and say, we defend ourselves. And so we reacted. There was a fear there, which resulted in anger, which then resulted in a reaction, which was, none of it was positive. And so the solution to the problem was usually a condemnation or a judgment made. Okay. Jesus, on the other hand, will often respond to a problem as opposed to react. So responding to a problem is not seeing the problem as from the perspective of fear, and hence then anger, but of love. And so you still have the problem, but you're responding out of love. Generally, when a person responds out of love, they don't see the person presenting the problem or the person who is the problem as the problem, but they see them as part of the solution, right? So they can see deeper. They can see around the corner. They can see the future and say, I see how this person can become part of the solution. Parents do this all the time. When a child makes a mistake, you realize that in that, because you love your child, that there is a path for them to learn from the mistake. That they're going to learn something better. And so it's the reason why sometimes parents will allow their children to make mistakes, because they know that in that they can grow, right? They can change. Okay, it's not because they want to see their kids fail, but they want to see them succeed. And so you allow the mistake, or so you're looking deeper, and it's rooted in a love. You see the solution in the person, in the problem, right? You see the solution that can happen. Okay, Now, let's look at how Jesus and the people he interacts with either react or respond. So let's go back to the gospel last weekend with the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus walks up to her. She's at the well. Now, Jesus immediately begins to respond, not react, but respond immediately. He doesn't see the Samaritan woman as part of the problem, even though she's, if we could say, a notorious sinner. She's made some mistakes, but also she's deeply wounded. I mean, anybody who's had 5 husbands is going to be deeply wounded, right? And so she's obviously had a train wreck in her life with marriage, and she's kind of given up. She's not even with a man who's her husband. And so Jesus could easily react to her and say, she's been married 5 times. You know how many annulments that's going to be? Just kidding. But the reaction, he could, and say, she's beyond hope. I mean, she's made... And then look at how she reacts to Jesus. So Jesus responds to her out of love, but she immediately throws that wall up and says, you think you can save me? You think you can change me? You think you have anything that you can offer me? Right? So there's already just a real hardness in her heart. And you know, we encounter people who are like that. People who've had hard lives tend to have hard hearts. But Jesus sets the model for us in what to do. Now, let's get back to Jesus so we see that model. So what does he do? He doesn't come to the woman and say, aha, you're a sinner. You've had 5 husbands. He doesn't immediately call her out on her sins. Rather, he presents what he hopes for in her. So what does he hope for? He goes up to her and he says, give me something to drink. Now, he's not talking about water. Give me something to drink. Because what he sees in her is what he sees in each and every human being. He sees the fact that we are fonts. We are fonts for living water. The living water comes from God, but we are the font that he created. Now, when we sin, when we harden our hearts, when we become broken, the font breaks. The font can't have the living water flow. And so he sees this font in front of him, the woman, and she's broken. The living water can't flow. And so he says to her, give me living water. Give me water to drink. Give me something to drink. Now, she doesn't know what he's really talking about at the moment, but he's pointing to the future and saying, this is what I desire. So if you think about a situation where you can react or respond, remember, the response is saying, this is what I desire to see in this person. So, I didn't really think of this beforehand, but let's use the analogy I used before. You get a negative evaluation at work. You get a criticism. Somebody criticizes you on something. You can react, but you decide, no, let me pray about it. I'm going to respond instead of react. What is it I desire to see from this person? Well, I desire, you say, as a Christian, I desire to see the truth, right? I want to see the truth. I want to have the humility to see the truth. And I want to be able to forgive the person if they're not truthful or if there was something that's unjustified. And so you go into that in a much different way. Okay, all right. So Jesus responds to her with this hope that she can be healed, that her font can be healed, okay? She immediately reacts. Now, she's pretty stubborn. She's pretty rude. But he doesn't give up, and so he keeps drawing it out of her. And so finally, he reaches that point where he does present the truth to her, the truth of her sinfulness, but the truth of the fact that she is a font. She's meant to have living water. That's what God created her for. And because of that, she begins to have hope. And so he slowly works that through until you reach this moment when she's running back into town because she desires. She's not being told to do it. She desires to share what she has received. Okay? Now, the disciples come on the scene. I know this is a little bit of review from last week. The disciples come on the scene and they react. They say the exact same thing the woman said. Why are you talking to her? You know, remember what she said? She said, why are you talking to me? And they say, why are you talking to her? And so Jesus then, through the course, needs to respond to the disciples. And that's when he begins to talk about having the bread or having the food which nourishes, food which is deeper. And so he uses that to teach the disciples. And then as the townsfolk come, then you have an opportunity for Jesus to respond to them. Continual responding out of love. Okay, see the person in front of you as part of the solution. Desire the truth, but see the future and what you hope for. And then draw that out of them. Okay. Now, we can bring this into the gospel today, or the gospel for this weekend. So you have the blind man who's been sitting by the synagogue for years begging. And here's the thing. He's been there for years, and yet he's almost become invisible. You have to love just how John uses the imagery of blindness and sight throughout this gospel. He's the blind man, and yet everybody else seems to be blind. So the Pharisees, on one hand, the Pharisees, as they begin to question him after he's been healed, they have no clue who he is. They've never even seen him. And yet the people who are in the area, they've seen him. It's like, oh, yeah, we know who he is. His parents live right there in town. Right? But the Pharisees are so blind to a person who's wounded, to a sinner, right? They immediately assume he's a sinner because he's blind. That they were blind to seeing him. He was invisible. What a great imagery for us to say, who in my life has become invisible to me? Who have I written off? Because the person I've written off, I'm sure we've all got our enemies, right? We've all got somebody that we just despise, somebody that we can't stand. And we'd say, okay, fine, if God wants to save him, fine, but send him to the other side of heaven when I'm up in heaven, because I don't want to ever see that person again, right? So that doesn't work. How to respond? Okay, so we go in the gospel. Jesus responds. He doesn't react, he responds. So his disciples react. His disciples say, who sinned? That blind man or his parents, right? Because we know one of them sinned. Otherwise, God wouldn't have cursed him that way. And Jesus says, no. Nobody sinned here. That man did not sin. His parents did not sin. In fact, it's the exact opposite. This infirmity is so that you can see, that the Pharisees can see, that everyone can see God's glory. Right? Okay. Jesus responds out of love to manifest, to show something deeper. He desires the salvation of all the people, and so he's going to use this infirmity to show the people so that they can have sight. All right. So obviously for God, there's something much worse than being blind physically. It's being blind spiritually. It's when the heart is hardened. It's when the person can't see. All right. Now, the blind man, does he react to Jesus or does he respond to Jesus? He's very docile. He's the kind of person who could easily be ignored or forgotten in our culture, in our society. And yet you sit down and talk to him and you realize this is a very precious person. There have been many times I've had people like a homeless person. I'm talking to him, and I sit down and talk to him, and I realize, wow, this person has a lot of wisdom. This person has been through a lot. And for them to have this perspective on life is incredible, right? So to say, wow, this person has more wisdom than most people who are really successful. All right, just a thought there. So the blind man begins to slowly respond to Jesus, just like the Samaritan woman, but he's more docile than she is to Jesus. And he slowly begins to see God spiritually right in front of him in the person of Jesus Christ. Whereas the Pharisees become harder and harder and harder. Their hearts become colder and colder and colder to Jesus. Now, that's essentially my homily. I want you just to be able to take that and say, all right, in my life, I got to watch out when I react. When people push my buttons, I got to step back, evaluate the situation, pray about it, and then do what Jesus does. He responds, okay? He responds in love, not in fear. But I want to go a little bit deeper with this, and maybe this will prove that, I don't know, maybe it's not making any sense. But anyways, when Jesus responds to the Pharisees, it seems more like he's reacting to them, right? It's almost like he's needling them. It's almost like he's pushing their buttons. He's just trying to get them upset. And so when he does the healing on the Sabbath, he intentionally does it in front of the Pharisees. He does it in such a manner so that the Sabbath is being violated, right? And so my question is Jesus just reacting to them? Is he just being passive-aggressive? We love being passive-aggressive in situations like that, right? Or is he actually responding in love? Now, Jesus responds to those who are invisible, to the sinners, to those who are broken, like a paramedic. I mean, he races towards them. He immediately interacts with them. He immediately engages them. And he doesn't react to their hostility. He responds, right? We already know that. The Pharisees, who are the religious leaders, who should be the people who do exactly what Jesus is doing, but have become habitual in doing the opposite, ignoring the person who needs healing, ignoring the sinner, rendering judgment, writing them off, just figuring they're damned. He responds to them in a different way. Now, how do you respond to hypocrites? Because that's what they are. They're hypocrites. They should be doing what Jesus is doing, but they're not. They should be caring for their flock, but they're not. How should we respond to that? Hypocrisy. Well, even in the Catholic Church, we have hypocrisy, right? We've had some priests do some really bad things. We've had some bishops do some really bad things. And I say that knowing that most bishops are really good, most priests are really good, but some are not so good. But I also want to talk about another version of the hypocrisy, not just priests who've done really bad things, but what can happen when we become like the Pharisees. We not only render judgment on all these people around us and seeing them as being pathetic and lost and we're so much better, but the reality is we're not better. But we look at each other and we're very forgiving. And so Pharisees are very forgiving to each other. They'll excuse anything. They'll sweep it under the carpet, right? But they won't do that for anybody else. And so when we have that kind of hypocrisy, when you have people who are supposed to be helping people grow in holiness, and they're very forgiving towards each other and to their mistakes, to their hypocrisy, to their corruption, but they do not do that for other people, how do you respond? Well, what do you hope for? You hope that they change. You call them out. You show them the truth. And so Jesus responds differently. He responds very forthrightly because they should be held accountable on a much higher level. And so this is where we respond to the fact that those who are to be held to a higher accountability, we have the right to hold them accountable. There's a writing from St. John Chrysostom, and he said that the floor of hell is carpeted with the skulls of priests. And he was a priest, right? He was a bishop. But what he recognized was that those who are higher, those who have more to be held accountable for, those who have more responsibility, the shepherds, they're going to be held accountable. And so Jesus, I think, sets a model for us to say they need to be held accountable. Now, I say that as a priest, knowing I need to be held accountable. Hopefully I'm holding myself accountable too. But when we see those who are shepherds not doing that, but rather doing what the Pharisees do, being really harsh and cold and judgmental towards the lowly, but then really, really forgiving towards themselves and others, we say, we need to change that. We need a complete reversal. And so I think that's the response then that Jesus challenges us with. Pope Francis has been challenging priests a lot. He's often very critical of priests. And I talk to priests about that, and it can become very discouraging. But I have to step back and realize that he's operating out of a framework where he sees corruption. And he wants to hold us accountable for that. Jesus does the same thing with the Pharisees. All right. But the difference between reacting out of fear and responding, desiring for the truth, and doing it out of love. All right. God bless.